Okay, it's a privilege and pleasure now to invite Hugh to come forward, if he wants to have a moment to get himself set up. Of course, you can come up here by all means. I was just going to say a brief word, just to move my stuff here, but we have been looking forward very much, Hugh, and to hearing your lecture. Thank you very much for undertaking this on the Welsh Mission in India. We have heard a great lot already, haven't we, this week, about all of the close links that we have in relation to India. So we look forward very much, and thank you very much for doing this for us. And we wish you all the best now as you come up to prepare yourself for the Davies lecture. Well, I have brought this with me because there was some trouble with the PowerPoint, which was left in the computer at home, part of the lecture I drafted. So I think we need to start at 12, and it's good to start promptly. So thank you for your kind words and for your kind wishes. I have never felt so much support in doing anything. And I have had great support from you as an assembly and as friends. The title? Okay, should we begin? Yes. The title that John Tidnor, well, he had been pressing to ask what are you going to talk about? Well, that impression that the mission in India left there and left on us also, this impression that mission, the impression of mission, what remains, what is the imprint on us at that time and on them at that time and on us now and on them also. I don't venture, well, to say that I have enough experience and knowledge. There are people who have much more here than I have, who were born in the field, who have been there many times, who have had many links and have worked there also. And we acknowledge that the support of all of you, that you've given me as I have drawn this up. It's because it's been over 55 years that have gone by now since the last missionaries had to return in 1968 from Mizoram, and the last ones from Kasia Jaintia, or the new state of Meghalaya, which was also formed in 1970 when Norman Tunnell and his wife Nurse Phyllis Tunnell returned to Britain. But we are now in a period when there is major reassessment taking place of the influence of missions around the world and how that work has been intertwined with the oppression of empire and even slavery in some countries, and great social and cultural change. To see the people of the tribes of northeastern India continuing to treasure this relationship between them and Wales, and to give thanks that it was a Welshman called Thomas Jones who was the first who brought the modern world to them through the medium of print and writing. It's an amazing thing and cause for us also to humbly give thanks, because Christianity took root there and bore fruit 100-fold. We now have a wider family that not only continues to claim this relationship with us as a church and a nation, but who also hold that relationship dear. We could start on the slides here, thank you. And here we have the areas that we are talking about in the northeastern part of India. A new map of the new states there, formed in the 1970s, which is different from how the old map would have looked of the mission field. Now, of course, those countries are, well, there's Bangladesh, that's come where the old Barasalet was, and so on. So that's the map there, which signifies that long-standing relationship that has existed between us, the generations of missionaries from Wales over 130 years. But who gets to explain this history that is connected with the colonial history, and how is it to be done? Now, the emphasis for some time has been on the native, and in a period when there is a great deal of reassessment taking place by all organizations, from governments to companies to newspapers. The Guardian has recently been engaged in this, and churches that have this history of mission among them. The CWM, Worldwide Family of Churches, set about launching a far-reaching project called Legacies of Slavery. The Onesimus Project was part of that, acknowledging that the roots of racial injustice were planted within the mission, the LMS Society in London, that we link with its and these were the ones that Anne Griffiths contributed to, and Panta Kellyn wrote, and well, the Calvinist Methodists set about establishing their own association, and the Welsh Independents continued to send missionaries through LMS. Do we then have anything to repent for as this great project done by the CWM does? Because from the minute that we decided to send the first missionary, Thomas Jones, to the hills of Kasha and Jaintia in the state of Meghalaya today, we made ourselves responsible for what would develop there. The investment in people, well, it's estimated that there are only about 200 who went there as part of the mission throughout the period in its entirety, the period of our mission. The investment in their resources, lives, and health in that period of 130 years has bound us in a special covenant. And by virtue of the fact that this relationship still exists, we also have the right to look at it and to look at the impression it has left on us. And this is what Professor Aled Griffith-Jones did when he offered his analysis in 2005 in the Assembly for Ffrwyth y Diwygiad, that lecture. And we had a variety of other lectures with giving attention to the mission in India over the years, not least last year from David Andrew Jones, and in the centenary of the Gordon Roberts Hospital in Shillong. And Aled Jones says that that the meaning of mission must be interpreted by each generation in its own way. He does this in 1997 on the 50th anniversary of India's independence. There and elsewhere, he notices the effect of this long relationship and connection between us and on us as Welsh people and as a nation in today's world. Only by telling their stories, he says, can the Welsh finally bring their missionaries home. And Nigel Jenkins also did that when he did those two things. He interpreted the meaning and told the story as he published his Gwalia in Kasha, which became the book of the year and was reprinted in 1995. And Andrew May, also, maybe you are less familiar with this book, also did that. He is an Australian historian who wrote this very substantial volume. You can see Well, you can have a look at them on the table over there by the window, along with a number of other things. It's interesting for us. I don't know if it's interesting for you, but what does this Australian have to do with us? Well, he has that particular relationship where he happens to be related to the first Thomas Jones and also to the second Thomas Jones. There were 4 Thomas Joneses there altogether, and there were Thomas Joneses at home also. So he is related to 2 of them and shows that networking.
Beth hynny a beth oedd a sut oedden nhw'n ffitio mewn hefo'r holl agenda trefedigaethol bryd hynny. Felly, fel dudodd William Prys, mae'r geiriau yma'n cael ei roi i'r cenhadwr William Prys, cenhadwr cyntaf yn Silet rhwng 1849 a'i ddiarddel yn a chan y Gymanfa Gyffredinol i gyd yn 1867. Stori arall ydy honno. Pawb yn sefyll ac yn galaru bod William Prys wedi ymadel â nhw yn ei dorio allan o'r corff. Ond fel hyn y mae Merfyn Jones, cenhadwr arall, yn rhoi geiriau iddo fo yn ei gyfrol Eryr Silet. William Prys ydy Eryr Silet. Mae'r wlad yma bydde fo yn gadael ei hôl ar ddyn. Ac wrth gofio'r golwg yna oedd ar William a Mary Lewis, fu o'n dal baich trymaf y genhadaeth yng Nghastia am 19 mlynedd, pan welodd nhw yng Nghymru ar ei gyfnod gartre yn 1861, mae o'n cofio, ac yn deud y geiriau yna. Mae'r wlad yma yn gadael ei hôl ar ddyn.
This country leaves its mark on someone. If we can continue with the slides, please, Hayes. And those words are ambiguous. The country left its mark on the missionaries, and the missionaries on the country and its people, and both on the country that sent them, and it has all left an impression on everyone. So, and that impression starts when we went together in 1993, 30 years ago this year, as part of the celebrations of the centenary of the arrival of the gospel. It was only 100 years then since the gospel got to the hills of Lushai as what later came to be known as Mizoram. And following from that, this relationship, going back on, we've been going, the visits we have been back on, we've had the privilege of experiencing how it has affected us, on Nan and myself and the family. We took our 3 children with us back in 2004. They still talk about that and they're still traumatized. But let us start then quite close to the beginning. As Robert Canville mentioned last night, and we were so pleased to see him here among us, the 22nd of June was Thomas Jones Day in the state of Meghalaya in India, a public holiday in most of the state, a state which has a strong measure of self-government under the Constitution of Greater India, with a population of 3 million souls or so. We were there earlier this year and arrived immediately after the state elections, and were there as the results of the 60 constituencies were announced the following week, with concerns about the influence of the majority culture of their neighbors in India being very evident. Does that situation perhaps remind you of anywhere else? It reminded us, and it reminded Thomas Jones also, as he and his wife Anne from Berryw in Montgomeryshire arrived there on that date. And let's see the next slides. We can keep them going. Perhaps we will pass on from that and go to this one, this view. It reminded Thomas Jones as well.
Sora neu Cherrapunji.
Sora or Cherrapunji, as the British called it, similar to Snowdonia, and the landscape of Jowai and Jaintier, similar to Montgomeryshire. So it was that many generations of Wales looked at the hills of Cashel, Jaintier and Lwshai and raised their eyes to them from the plains in Sylhet. We have ideas about what overseas mission is, and those ideas are tied up with colonial studies and people like Dr. Livingstone and so on, and H.M. Stanley, and the whole reassessment of his contribution and what the British Empire was to stand for, the 3 C's of empire: commerce, civilization, and Christianity. And to what extent did the Welsh missionary look at all different to that? There is an effort in Wales and in India to argue that the fact that the missionaries who went to these rainy hills and the distant beacons in the States, which came to be known as Meghalaya and Mizoram, and to the hot oven, to those plains which are mostly in Bangladesh today, were Welsh and were able to speak Welsh, and knew about colonial and linguistic oppression, set them apart and gave this Welsh mission its own impression and flavour. And we could say that this Welsh view of mission, of overseas mission, was different because of their unique experience. But one might almost say that the Welsh mission was based on 3 other C's, namely Charles from Bala, Calvinism, and competition. That, apart from other Welsh things that don't bring up the same kind of memories in the minds of anyone other than Welsh nonconformists, things like Mother's Gift, Sunday School, and the tonic Solfa. The surprising thing is that the memory of Thomas Jones has endured so well that his statues still decorate the yards of churches and institutions in the Cashel Hills. But noticing when we look at these statues that it's a statue of a man from the East that we see, possessed by the culture or claimed by the culture he went there to present the good news to. And I'm not sure whether that one is still standing or whether it's been, but well, with regard to mission, well, we think, where did these people learn to do mission work? And what, well, because the interest in India since the days of Pantakelin had been planted there, talking a lot about India, and we are surprised as they come and are trained in this new institution in Coleg in 1834. There's nothing in particular other than their knowledge of the Bible and the doctrines of the Christian faith that qualified them for the work. That, together with the zeal and education that Thomas Charles had given to them, they didn't have to ask, what are we going to do? They knew what they were going to do there. They were going to establish schools, and we're going to teach people according to similar patterns as to what had happened in Wales. And Thomas Charles is like a sort of protective spirit over it all. And when we were in Sora, in the old theological college that's there now, in the Mission Training Centre, we took this book off the shelf. It's D. Jenkins' biography of Thomas Charles. It's been eaten alive by insects, as all of the old books had been there. But this picture remained there and is very important there. And we just think about them, Thomas Jones and John Roberts, although they were only children when Thomas Charles died in 1814. These 2 friends, Thomas Jones and John Roberts Minimus, one of the most keen supporters of the mission, the overseas mission, that he was the strongest supporter possible, other than in the sense of being there himself. He said farewell to Thomas and
never to be seen again. Byth i'w gweld
well,
nhw eto, ond drwy hebiaeth i gysylltu
they
hefo nhw o bell. Ac mae o'n dyhau,
and
John Roberts yn dyhau
John Roberts longs for this correspondence that took so long to arrive, and Thomas Jones wrote to him finally, fulfilling his promise according to the book of Proverbs, saying it would be foolish, not to say sinful, for me to be sent all the way to India to spend all my life writing to my friends at home. But they depended on this correspondence with their friends at home. Thinking about them, they were Thomas Charles's children, having been influenced, as Wyn James notes in another lecture. And a part of this building that had begun to be built by Thomas Charles on those foundations that he had laid. And Thomas Charles's expectations of the children of his period were high, and his trust in them inspired them to do better at all times. And John Roberts Minimus's commitment to the same ideals of Bible and Sunday school and mission made him a very worthy child. And Minimus indeed belonged to this influential family, his sister having married Thomas Charles's nephew. And Thomas Jones would also come across another part of the family presently, as he welcomed Dr. Owen Richards, who was married to the granddaughter of Thomas Charles, the sister-in-law of Lewis Edwards in Bala, under whom he trained as one of the first students who went through the academy in Bala, and his little son Owen Charles, the great-grandson of Thomas Charles, who came to see him and his wife Anne in Sora in India. Well, imagine that happening. And it's sufficient to say, well, we could say a lot more, that Minimus, as a secretary and organizer and administrator of this mission, worked hard to include what would be of advantage and not to include what would not be advantageous as for people to know about the mission, and does so in the Trysorfa with his fellow editor Roger Edwards. A letter from John Roberts Minimus is in his hand here. We can imagine that's from Thomas Jones. And Powell has lectured on that some years ago in the history lecture here. Thomas Jones was a man who could do everything, according to Andrew May, who has given the fullest biography so far in that imperial period. This was the man who told the Cashans which day the moon would be changing. He was the one who could saw trees without wasting the whole log. He was the one who could burn lime using coal. It was he who had asked John Roberts to send him work tools rather than books. And the need was announced in the Trysorfa, and all kinds of things came, including materials and even an old dress from Sally Charles in Bala. She had been in her grave some time. It was sent out to India, and you imagine that material being turned into clothes for the children in Kasha, and how those real links of inheritance were made in Minimus's mind. The treasury, the Trysorfa, was a very useful and widely circulated instrument. We have Roger Edwards shouting in 1854, who will commit again to go to Kasha and Sylhet to help our brothers who are left alone there, encouraging them to go to all kinds of other places too. Where is the spirit of the old Methodist fathers to say, behold me, send me? And so this gentleman, Thomas Jones from Berryw, he was this enigma who gave literary form to the language of the Cashans. He was sent there to teach and to preach the gospel. But the fact that he was able to do all kinds of things, like Paul, that's where he learns. So I became everything in order to win over some people. And they still continue to celebrate that date, the 22nd of June. Remember that date? To celebrate, but to celebrate above all, remembering this Welshman, not only him himself, but who they are now themselves, people who have a written language with literature and a gospel to treasure. By 1866, John Roberts was exhausted and having tried to keep his own business with its head above the water and personal losses and the troubles he would incur endlessly as a spokesman and a supporter for this troubled and fragile little mission. He resigns. He has to. He is pressed to resign. They cannot keep someone who had become bankrupt as part of this organization. And as people like William Priest presently turn their back on him, and they leave him with no option but to resign and to go to Scotland, as he had left no option for Thomas Jones 20 years earlier other than to resign when the relationship between the missionaries and Jones became embittered, and when he went into his own business and remarried, having lost Anne, with a young girl from the local area who was apparently almost 16, because this country had left its heavy impression on him. Poor old Thomas Jones is the assessment of J. Hughes Morris, the historian, at the end of his colourful and troubled life. But hadn't it all been on the point of being lost several times over? What will become of our poor beleaguered little mission? Roberts would often sigh. The mission that had started earlier there by Alexander B. Lish, an 18-year-old Anglo-Indian that had come to a sudden end. Well, what would become of this fragile mission? And if things had wound up, all of the critics would have been able to sit back and say, told you so, like Henry Rees, who argued that £1,000 spent in India, not to mention the converts, would go a very long way at home. And the need was great at home. And that dilemma they continue to live with that dilemma throughout the entire period, and with the trouble over impropriety and the tensions of working with Owen Richards and the loss of the son of Edward Jones from Maes Plum, the promising and very committed missionary Daniel Jones, and the burial of his little daughter in the same coffin as him, and the loss of Thomas's wife, Anne Jones, even when we were there by the graves in Sora. We would always get that story. Those were all lost. It meant, well, there were as many in the cemetery as there were by this point in the field by the time Thomas Jones left in 1847. They were strong characters. There were a lot of friction between them as well. But there was no attention paid to that at home. The letters were edited and the most positive view possible was presented. The correspondence was kept for as long as possible between John Roberts and Thomas Jones without telling the other directors of the mission, let alone printing it in the Trysorfa, which would have been very hungry for such stories. Were they then making an idol of the mission? Everything seemed to be sacrificed on the altar of the reputation and continuity of this fragile new Welsh mission. Even my reputation, complained Owen Richards back in Bala after 2 years in the field. The records are cautious and careful. The good name of the denomination, the sacrifice of the missionaries so far, and the father's memory were all in the balance. We see John Roberts from Scotland and from the view he takes from there, with different people writing to the current Secretary of the Mission in 1873, where things have become better established, new contracts having been drawn up with the missionaries. But the problems still came up, as with Thomas Jones, the second, almost in the same way, like a mirror of the first lot of problems. And he says, but I believe that if they were not indulged, they would gradually cease from expecting and demanding all details in connection with cases of this sort. Don't mention anything about this in the Trysorfa. Don't indulge these Welsh people who like these stories and gossip constantly and gossip about these things. Give them good things, not the stories, the gossip that was to be shared, but it was the statistics then that were important. How many schools, how many converts? That was the emphasis, as we can see from this picture of the early work in Kasha. This is a page from the statistics. It's quite acceptable, but quite small in that early period. Counting every single thing, I wonder where the church in India has learnt that practice. But the intention from the beginning was to transfer the work into the hands of the native people, to be able to leave them be because the work was done. And the General Assembly delegation that visited the whole area for 4 months in the winter of 1935 to 1936 and presented a report by the 1936 Assembly, mainly recommending that the work should be transferred to the care of the local presbyteries and assemblies at that time. Although it was the foreign mission that would still pay the salaries and costs of the missionary, they were to be considered a gift to the native church and to be under their authority. And that vision is kept to. And R.J. Williams, the third secretary of the mission in 1912, tells one of the missionaries who was there, well, gives him a scolding really, for not giving enough room in the reports to the native preachers, as that would distract attention from the efforts of the missionaries themselves. And Mervyn Jones wrote a novel in the form of imaginary letters from Mary Lewis, William's wife, to her friends back in Wales, reporting there all the early rumours that John Roberts was anxious to keep out of the press. It was time at that point to tell them, because it wouldn't any longer affect the mission itself, which had come to an end. And as with authors in India, it notes the great debt to William and Mary Lewis for the continuation of that mission at all in a period that's so full of tensions and losses. And perhaps by the time Gwen Rhys Roberts, Pitay, as she was called in Mizoram, publishes her biography in 2001, the interest has reduced, and this is a publication by the church itself in order to record this very important story. The great privilege, mentions the great privilege of having been there until the period after the rebellion, when they came back in 1968 without any hope of seeing that state again, but she gets to see it in 1985 and in 1994, and has very sweet memories of it. and she was able to preach in the centenary celebrations and keeping the flame on the altar alight, as it were. And the departure of the last missionaries from Mizoram went together with the establishment of the first field of mission in the hills of Mikir in Assam, and today there are about 3,300 missionaries working in their own states and others in India and the surrounding countries in this sort of junction of an area between so many countries in South and Southeastern Asia. And while publishing in Wales and the numbers are reducing, the longing for the desire for versions back in India is on the increase. It's their own history, and the mantle of recording this history is transferred to them. And the mantle also of assessing the contribution of the Welsh missionaries and of raising up their own heroes is more and more to the fore. And then and again, they tell of the need that there is to make these materials available to them, which again are here in Wales, being held in our imperial castles, such as the National Library. But if the mission depended on the telling of a story and telling the history, and if that was what caused it to flourish, the most exotic story of all, perhaps, and the narrative that gave the greatest boost to this mission between 1861 and 1863 is the story of Ular Singh Congwyr. He was brought up from the age of 11 with William and Mary Lewis. He grew into a talented young evangelist and insisted when they were about to come home because of illness at the end of 1860, after 18 years being there, more or less by themselves, he insisted on coming with them. And this is the narrative that is given of him in Griffith Ellis's biography on William Lewis. Maybe his coming home with them from the far country was something similar to those trophies that were brought home from India by the imperialists, tiger skins, elephant heads, and so on. They would bring home with them. Well, here we have a living trophy, and the most treasured one there is. There was no one of the missionaries had come home from more or less anywhere before this who could tell the story and satisfy the interest that the Methodists had to hear it, other than Owen Richards, who had come home under a cloud, having been a matter of great embarrassment. And Josiah Hughes died in Malacca in 1840 as Thomas and Anne were sailing to India. And the other great man from Montgomery, John Davis from Tahiti, didn't come home at all and dies in Tahiti in 1854. Isaac Hughes dies in South Africa after 47 years there, and so on. Getting missionaries back was a great thing to experience, therefore, and Ular Singh becomes very beloved of everyone who meets him. He is able to realize his dream. He had heard and read about it in the book of instruction by Charles that is published in Cashen, and the confession of faith and the story of the connection to that point. And that is a story that is given to them, and he reads it and longs to see this country and to come to this country that he had heard so much about. And having come, he doesn't understand what's going on there. If only he could understand Welsh, but he can sing the tunes, the Welsh tunes, and with his own hymns for this crowd. And there are verses by Eben Vardd written about him and presented to him as, "Ye sons of British Christians, take now Ularsing's hand, to see our preachers' college, to see our gospel band, to see our institutions, to see our Christian rule, to see our associations, to see our Sunday school. This boastfulness that the Methodists felt, seeing him come back and being able to show it all to him, and he, well, he doesn't get to return. This country leaves its mark on this young man also very heavily. He catches pleurisy. He spends a period being looked after in Liverpool and Mold, and dies in Caergwrle in August 1863, and he's buried among the great and the good in Chester, with a headstone to compete with any other grave there, that gives his story in Welsh and in English, and raised up as the first fruit of Cassia. And there he lay, with visitors to his grave becoming more and more scarce, not either in Wales or in Cassia, a parable of the forgetfulness and everything that this had cost. So where is Ularsing's grave? It's a listed monument in the middle of this cemetery in Chester. But if he didn't come home, the missionaries become a small regiment, and by the 20s, there are about 50 missionaries in the field at any one time. And this is not all one-way traffic. The missionaries give inducements to come back to Wales. If you can see in Pantycelyn's, you can see the table and the communion table that have been given there by Hindu Christians, as they were called, in the Carmarthen Journal in 1888. And with that lack of proper naming, they wouldn't be Hindu at that time any more than they are now. But along with those gifts that came back, there's something else which also comes back now. There are letters coming back to the mission office from the Cassians themselves. They have been taught, the Bible has been shared with them, and they now have the tools to criticize their fellow Christians, to criticize the missionaries there for their arrogant attitudes in the case of some of them. You see those letters coming back. The story of the visits is you can see now heritage tourism becoming established in these places where the first missionaries went. So we have the Nongswalia Chapel, and it is being a heritage centre built, which will be filled, no doubt, with a great lot of missionary junk, as these missionary bits of bric-a-brac, as they call these things, they call them. The stuff that the Americans brought over with them. We saw an exhibition in Mizoram of all of these things with their kerosene heater and their pisobari teapot and so on. They're all treasured and exhibited. But now, well, we think about what the difference is between this relationship, what happened here, and any other mission, in fact. and we see
Mae'r gwahaniaeth
the difference
rwsyd yn y fan yma
somehow
ydy'r ffaith nad ydy'r
here is the fact that this interest does not stay with the missionary junk. It doesn't stop at that. In what the missionaries did there, that's what is interesting, and the relationship that goes back over the sea to the west, to Wales, to the chapels where these things were decided, to the homes of the first missionaries and their graves and the colleges and the country and the people themselves who sent them over generations of time. I know, well, that was my concern from the beginning, how to cut down this lecture. It is large and and detailed at times. So, well, I'm thinking about that impression that if we go through a few of these slides, we will try and find again. This is the generosity that we see here. What is being fostered here is this generosity and this connection with the mission in India. We note in the Cenhadwr, the missionary, which is set up especially to relate the missionary stories in order to inspire support. We can see here from 1936 a gold watch being the sale of a gold watch, £4.14, and a bequest of £50 among the great gifts. And there are also smaller gifts. And it is these gifts that sustain this small, fragile mission. It always needs more, and it's always being said that there isn't enough, and this has been throughout it all. Something that has been a benefit to it, and that has meant that they have been more able to stand on their own 2 feet. And we see things like those plaques in the hospitals that are still there, and from London and from other churches in Wales, and they still adorn the walls and they still polish them. That is the surprise, and it's a surprise to us. Recently, that collection that was made, it was 50,000 through the period of the pandemic, which was given towards the work for an oxygen condenser in the Shillong hospital in India. There we have the medical director very proudly standing in front of that machine. So the relationship with us continues to be a two-sided relationship. But what was the relationship with the empire? And in terms of the British Empire, well, we have something to repent for in that sense. No doubt we do. It would be nice if we didn't, but these things come into view now. And I had a meeting with a filmmaker from Shillong who lives in this country now, who had investigated the Labour Corps history from the First World War, the history of the mission. Well, we have Miriam Lloyd gives some attention to this Labour Corps history in the history on Mizoram, people who came as laborers to make trenches and routes for the tanks in the First World War. They were sent into this war machine supported by the mission, and there's even a request asking for the support of the Welsh Mission to send the Labour Corps into Europe and into Mesopotamia. And there's every sign that that support came. In days when money was short and when the mission was afraid that they would have to make cutbacks. There is money here to send the native people to make pathways for their tanks back in Europe. And we find a number of missionaries, chaplains during that war. There were 20 Cassians died after a work of traveling in India. They hadn't got out of there before. They didn't get. And there's a memorial there in the middle of Shillong to those who went to the war. And this smooth and difficult relationship with the empire continues throughout all. And we see missionaries with medals, being very proud of them, and Kaiser Wanghind medal and things of that sort. We see a picture of Mr. Rees wearing his medal very proudly there. We went back to Mould. He is most proud of his spiritual work. And so we see these commentators and those who are now telling this history, people such as B.L. Nombri in the Theological College in Shillong and others, and people who are telling this history and saying things such as in the title of books, your history is not our story. We see them, we see that this mission had to go alongside on the path that the British Empire was opening up for them. But they had their own agenda. And that agenda, that mission agenda, of course, clashes very often with the agenda of the British Empire. That is why things become difficult for R. Thomas Jones at first. He insists, well, Nigel Jenkins sees him as a freedom fighter, but that gives an image of that the present age has and projects it onto that age. But he was willing to stand with those who were suffering this injustice in Cassia. Peter Fraser, likewise, Dr. Peter Fraser, who is in Mizoram, is also criticized for standing with those who were having to do forced labor there, and is warned not to do that, and is ultimately exiled by the authorities, and is not to come to the state again. So he goes to other states and establishes work there. So F.S. Downs, the father of has done so much work inspiring historians and theologians as well about this great work. Well, but we see in Wales this foggy period as the mission comes to an end. At that time, a period of having to examine and say, well, what is happening now? We see the moderator of the General Assembly, that's somehow the thread running through this, that the moderator of the General Assembly in 1968 can write in the Cenhadwr about the necessity for missionary work in the face of these missionaries coming back from India and asking the question, well, what now, as they return? And there's a generation coming up, of course, in the face of the decline of nonconformism in the 60s and the 70s and from then on, who don't know anything about the names of these missionaries, as Ernest Jones says in in his Sunday school textbook in 1982. There's been a generation come up in our churches who don't even know the names of these people, and this is he says, a tragedy and a loss. The missionary officer had done so much to promote these names, and I found a box full of these little books for people who were collecting for these mission boxes. They were just in a box gathering dust when we got to Coleg Bala in 1994 up in the tower. And that illustrates these and by our time, we see this reassessment from historians. Is it the dramatist who takes the liberty with the truth? And we saw a performance, a very special performance. You could move on here to that slide. Our friends here, with the great welcome that we had in the theological colleges, with 280 students, this wonderful production made by University of Wales, the University of South Wales, directed by Dr. Lisa Lewis, having investigated the history, having got hold of the history, and you might be worried, what are they going to do with this? Well, there's plenty in it. They found good things, and they present what is very beautiful in this performance. And there we have the books that signify that difference between cultures, books coming, print coming to a culture that was entirely oral before then, and coming into their own circles and making their own place. And it is very beautiful indeed, if you ever have an opportunity to look back at that. And to conclude, and as Aled Griffith-Jones says, he said there was never a mission, but that was new in every generation, each one new in its own age. And as we note, when Nigel Jenkins feels that he has rediscovered this link, and it is he who says that this is the largest overseas venture ever undertaken by the Welsh. It's quite a big thing to say, and he feels that he has rediscovered all of it when he goes there. It was never lost to us, but it's still being assessed, and there are still materials coming to light, and there will still be. It's a great mine, a deep mine of materials that there are to be brought to light in our time as well. And thinking about this relationship that is ongoing, and we've had visits recently. Our friends have come to our assembly here this week, and this relationship in recent time has been taken up again by young people, by your General Secretary, as you heard her mention her experience in Mizoram in 1991. The first of the young people to go back there after that closed period because of the rebellion and the difficulties that came in the wake of that. to taking up this relationship again. We've had workers come to us. Sankume has been here for some years with his family. John Amingday, Colmy and the family back in Isol. We have heard the rejoicing at Rebecca Albiaksangi, who is a candidate now for us. Mr. Ram has shared her with us. And we think about all of these connections, this relationship, not one so much of dependency, but of mutual involvement, not like many of the other missionary relationships that denominations have. I might venture to say the Church of Scotland with churches in Africa, many of which are relationships of dependence on Western generosity. These are that kind of relationship can be one-sided. And we give thanks that this relationship continues to be a two-way one. And as we go there and encourage their prayers, well, we cannot know what the outcome will be of asking for those prayers, but that they pray specifically for our situation in Wales, the 1.6 million that there are now of Presbyterians in northeastern India and that surrounding area. They often call us Mother Church. With all the problem that there is in terms of our partnership within CWM in calling us a Mother Church, but it would be a kind of imperialism to tell the church in India to stop calling us that. And we are grateful for their care for us in their prayers in these days. What will come of this? Well, there's not a lot of time to mention, just these aspects that we feel are part of us and we still treasure. What was the effect of having people among us who were able to speak 5, 6, 7, 8 languages because they had been missionaries? And we could name them here. People like people who counted these things ordinary. What was the effect of that on our perception of the world around us? What do you call an Englishman in another language? Well, whatever you like, he won't understand you. But what do we call ourselves somehow here? Well, we have insisted that these missionaries learn languages. We've insisted on bilingualism and diversity, and that has no doubt made a contribution to our diversity as a nation. And Ular Singh, had he been able to go home, had he lived in this time, he could have been in Lincoln back in March, seeing the 100,000 that came there to the association in Kasha, and the praise there was, and how their establishments and their Sunday school are flourishing now there. And he would have been amazed that it had all gone much further than we ever had seen in Wales. Welsh Confidence sent these Welsh missionaries there to India. Confidence on the part of a very small denomination somehow, but this was a confidence that we had in the Victorian era, which was expressed at that time in terms of competition and the competition between denominations. We saw much energy going into our institutions, national education, and our buildings at that time, and there was that gave tremendous energy to this. Well, in the case of the tithe war, nationality being expressed in religious identity. Perhaps there was a danger that the non-conformist Welsh tried to take the Welsh culture for themselves. Well, it was in the 1890s that we reached Christianity, and after that, the great confidence that was seen at that time was not to be seen anymore. But it was, if the trace of that, the mark of that confidence and the energy can be seen very clearly in the mission to India, which found its own life. It went beyond the expectations of Thomas Jones and John Roberts and perhaps and the founders. It's remarkable to our eyes now. The vision was a great one at that time, and it is still being realized today. And we need to rejoice with our sisters and brothers in India and stand together in the midst of our worries and our current troubles in India and in Wales, and try and seek some of that missionary confidence that is exhibited in their missionary life, reflected back at us today from India. And thank you very much, all of you, for listening. Well, I want to say thank you, but it's not for me to thank Hugh officially. So Reverend Powell-Davies will come forward to give official thanks on our behalf. Well, Mr. Moderator, it is my responsibility and my privilege on your behalf to express our appreciation, our thanks to Hugh for his lecture. I just want to do three things. I'm aware that you're all thinking about your lunch now, but listening to yesterday's discussion about the pattern of the assembly as it's to be in the future, well, the assembly is a mixture of business, of fellowship, of worship and education. And may that continue. I would emphasize that first. But thanks to Hugh for a rich lecture, an interesting one, first of all. I didn't go to university. I said in the Coleg Normal, and the teacher would say, well, show them something, you get more interest then. Well, it was interesting telling us a story, but more than a story, enabling us to start this process of analysis. And in that, you would say, Hugh, well, is there room for repentance, reassessment? But the question, well, what remains when we think about the mission? What remains? Thank you very much indeed, Hugh, for beginning something which will continue in our minds after this lecture. This wealth that makes us think about our today and our tomorrow. And that's the last final point, the inspiration of the past. How much the Welsh have done in the name of Christianity, how much the Welsh have done in the name of education, industry, but also Christianity. You have Ben Rees's book. I'm choosing my words carefully. Well, it's what's being said sometimes is not always quite right, but it's a summary of, it's not a full summary, but of the contribution of Wales to the Christian religion. And I have Reverend Dr. Roland Williams, who was in India, not with the Presbyterians, but with the Baptists, was there for 50 years. Well, the wealth and inspiration of the past tells us about opportunities today. And there were two phrases that will remain with me after this lecture. You said more than once, little mission. And the question, what will become of this fragile mission? That was what was asked at one point. What will become of this fragile mission? Well, we've seen what became of it. Incredible. And so encouraging to see the fruit of that mission as part of our witness and ministry now here in Wales. Hugh, thank you so much. It's a sign of a good lecture always is that you are still thinking and still wanting to investigate. Thank you very much.